If you're one of those fellow viewers who's been seeing my content since 2016 to 2019, you might be aware that I have made videos on the vintage computers I've got on eBay, or at times some other online stores at the time. I've also been doing this since I was a 12-year-old crayon eater, who was filming this stuff on a cheapo webcam or on a Nintendo 3DS with an SD card. In fact, this is one of the only surviving footages from 2013 as my dumb self deleted my oldest YouTube channel, and it has been years. And most of the storage I've had that may have contained these materials either got damaged or disappeared. But anyways, this is something I haven't done in a while, but since my channel has grown a little bit, I thought to myself, why not revisit the idea of making vintage computing videos, and that I will start off with dusting out my old Compaq Presario 5032, or what was left of it. So for those wondering, I dubbed this one the Uncanny Compaq, and this has to do with the fact that the front and side panels were removed. The front panel's plastic started to break apart, and sadly I don't have them anymore to try to restore it. So like my THEPentiumII machine, which is also dubbed the bare metal machine, it will have to do without it. When I described this machine to some of my friends, they believed it would make sense to call it a test bench. Though, if it were one, it would be a very limited kind if anything. You see, OEM manufacturers were known to add proprietary components. I believe it was likely to save cost. After all, it is a low-cost computer from the late 90s. But it wasn't entirely as bad as it was compared to nowadays. Like my main computer, the Dell Optiplex 9020, doesn't have a 24-pin ATX connector, but rather a 4-pin connector. Luckily, you can obtain adapters for cheap. Well, anyway, this uncanny machine comes with a Klamath Intel Pentium II clocked at 300 MHz. And normally I would have thrown a 400 MHz, but I don't know for sure if it works. And by that, I mean, will the motherboard even support it? Plus, I aimed for the specs to somewhat match my first vintage PC since the Dell Dimension L from 2006, originally released in 2000, and that machine being the HP Pavilion 4450. I mean, sure, it doesn't have an Intel Celeron 333 MHz and that Riptide sound card, but it's close enough. It even has an ATI Rage LT Pro that many OEM motherboards have integrated with at the time. Normally, I didn't use ATI as much as Nvidia, normally because of driver issues. However, by revisiting it, it turns out that, unlike Nvidia, the latest drivers are just about more refined than the older versions. Then again, both brands have their own issues. Like back when I used a Riva TNT card, my main issue stems from games using DirectX. Like Unreal for instance, causing graphical issues, and the weapon models are a prime example of this. It also didn't help that this game wasn't designed for DirectX and OpenGL but more with 3dFX Glide. Now while 3dFX was really popular at the time, it has aged like milk in my opinion, and it has become one of the reasons why I ended up resorting to software rendering as a worst case scenario. Like, getting a Voodoo card is almost like needle in a haystack for an affordable price. And it kinda proves that getting into the hobby is getting pretty expensive. And the only way you could get a hold of a vintage computer, or a certain part, for an affordable price, depends on your location and the fact that you have to be lucky to come across an offer. And this is usually why I call emulators like DOSBox, PCEM, and 86box a godsend. Because why would you want to spend about $200 on an untested 3dFX Voodoo 2 when you can use that to buy a new RTX 3060 for a similar price? Also, it's still a shame that nobody hasn't made like a hardware PCI based glide wrapper or a re-implementation of a 3dFX Voodoo 2 that you can assemble on your own. Like, I certainly wouldn't mind building my own, just to avoid the need to shell out a bunch of money for a used one that could crap out any day. But in today's world, I wouldn't have a choice but to save up money for one in the future. I mean, sure, glide wrappers exist for Windows 9X, but even that had issues with Unreal. It may work for other games, but I've yet to try that out. Anyway, 3D effects rant aside, the ATI Rage LT Pro is basically a lesser version of the ATI Rage Pro that came out in 1997. While the one I have is on board, there is an AGP variant out there. The onboard chip also has 2 MB of VRAM, and while I could upgrade the VRAM with a stick, the plastic holding the RAM in place was starting to break apart, so I am likely stuck with the 2 MB I got for this one. This machine does come with the usual CD drive, but it does also include a zip disk drive. It is currently left unused because I don't have any around me, nor have any uses for them, as there are more better methods out there for transferring files. As for storage, we're going to use a 6 GB MaxStore hard drive I had laying around. It was originally manufactured for the iMac G3 that I had, but it had issues powering on. So I felt like repurposing this hard drive for this old Compaq. Now, to make things even more uncanny, the operating system of choice will be the MSDN copy of Windows Millennium Edition. Now, I know some will drop a comment on why Windows ME is a terrible piece of horseshit for the millionth time, but hear me out. I believe Windows Millennium Edition isn't as bad as many make it out to be. And as somebody who's used this operating system since childhood, I haven't noticed too many issues, so it's decent in my book. However, I still believe Windows 98 2nd Edition is still a better choice overall. As a matter of fact, I look at Windows ME as basically Windows 98 SE with extra stuff and some cutdowns. Like the lack of MS-DOS mode. Will that stop me from playing my favorite DOS games? Well, not really. Because thanks to the fact that this is technically the last Microsoft OS to be based on the ancient MS-DOS platform, you can still run DOS games inside of Windows, or most of it, and even the audio is still fine, because this machine comes with an onboard ESS 1869 audio drive. The ESS audio drive is basically one of those Sound Blaster clones at the time, and certain low-cost machines during that time came equipped with these. However, as time went on, the Sound Blaster standard started to fade away in favor of Realtek's AC97 audio codec that had been around since 1997. This machine also has one stick of 128 MB of SD RAM. Not really dual channel as I hoped, but it'll do either way. The install process took a bit of time. Usually because after partitioning the hard drive through F-disk, the default format program in the boot disk that I burnt onto a CD containing the install files doesn't allow quick formatting, unless the drive has already been formatted. I mean, it would have taken even more longer if this was like a 40 GB hard drive. But even then, I don't think that this machine would recognize the drive unless I used a PCI IDE bus that allowed that much storage capacity. After that, I went ahead and copied the install files from the CD to the newly created Win9x folder inside my hard drive before installing. This is usually a routine I follow because I don't want to heavily rely on installing Windows directly from the CD-ROM. And even that causes some issues with copying certain files. And this is from experience. Even the installers for Windows XP are the worst of it. Now there is one advantage with the MSDN release of Windows ME, and that is the product key is entered for you, so you don't need to scour through the internet looking for a working product key. So after about 30 or so minutes of setting up Windows ME, and since a video driver was found and installed, I shall present one of the worst parts of the installation process, the difficult to close introduction video. Yeah, that system restore ain't going to fix jack shit. Anyway, I had to use a USB flash drive to copy over the network drivers, and that's one of the good things about Windows ME, the fact that it allows USB drives out of the box. Prior to this, you had to install a certain driver off of somewhere and install it. It was one of those methods I liked to use back in the day. Well, next to using burnt CDRs before I started to rely on file sharing instead. And it wasn't too long before I replaced the Microsoft version of the drivers with the ATI drivers from 2002. Usually because I recall having some issues trying to get DirectX on Unreal Tournament working. Well, despite the driver update, it still gave me an error, although I managed to get around to that by running it in 320x200 resolution. Weird, huh? But more on that later. So as expected, software rendering will have to do for the time being. And interestingly enough, with a little bit of tweaks, it is somewhat playable and practically enjoyable. Like, I'm sure some people had the choice of either buying a 3DFX card or a faster processor at the time. And the latter I think aged a bit more well than trying to buy a Voodoo 2, but that's not saying a lot. The demand is out there, and getting a vintage computer isn't as affordable as it once was, sadly. While Unreal Tournament is serviceable, I can pretty much say the same for Unreal. This is the unpatched version that only has support for software rendering, 3DFX Glide, and PowerVR SGL. Honestly, it has been a long while since I've played Unreal under software rendering, especially on real hardware. And it still kinda has an appeal to it, and without a 3DFX card, you might as well work with what you got. For the resolution for both games, I recommend playing it at 320x200 or 400x300. I mean, if you could tweak it a bit more, you could still enjoy it at 512x384 resolution. But I believe the ATI still has a fighting chance, but likely not for games running on the Unreal Engine, or so I thought. We'll get back to that soon. Here we have id Software's arena shooter from 1999, Quake 3 Arena, which uses OpenGL. Under the default settings, it struggles with the time demo and results show nearly 13 frames per second. But unlike many games today, games like these were designed to be tweaked to squeeze more frames. So after some tweaking, I was able to get 23.4 frames per second in the time demo. Now, that's what people had to work with back then, as these games were demanding when they first came out. There are more tweaks you could do to squeeze in more frames, like hiding the weapon model and even disabling the jibs. Although, it would take some time to adjust before you can start fragging your way to the top. But then again, I have become spoiled by wanting 60 frames per second. And with machines like these, it just becomes from difficult to impossible without resorting to upgrading the CPU and even the graphics card. So in my eyes, the ATI may have a fighting chance if you set your expectations pretty low. The last game to look at is Valve Software's Half-Life, another game that came out in 1998. Known for its story-based progression unlike many shooters before it. It was also based on a heavily modified Quake engine known as Gold Source. I've tried it out under Direct3D, but apparently there are some weird texture issues, so I switched to OpenGL and apparently the issue went away. The game does tend to dip when there's a lot going on, but other than that, it is still serviceable. You could somewhat get away with it by running this under 400x300 resolution to squeeze in more frames. Though I am beginning to wonder if the VRAM upgrade could make a difference. Sadly, like I said earlier, the plastic that holds the RAM in place is starting to break apart, and we'll need an alternative way to keep it in place. Tape maybe? However, I did manage to try that out a little bit, and while it didn't work out, the RAM chip is somewhat being held in place by the case itself. So because of that, I've managed to go up to 6 MB of VRAM. And apparently this managed to fix my issue between Unreal Tournament and Direct3D. And surprisingly, it went pretty well in 512x384 resolution. Quake 3, however, didn't make too much of a difference when running the time demo at 512x384 as well. So safe to say I'm satisfied with the upgrade. However, just like Half-Life, I've noticed that the blurry textures are there. I've begun to wonder if it's a driver issue or something that needs to be turned off. May need to research that sometime. However, outside of gaming, it is kind of a surprise that internet browsing is still a thing, albeit limited depending on the web browser of choice. At least for me, there is ProtoWeb to browse old but restored websites, and there is also my own website. If I wanted to watch a video, I would load up WarpStream and watch old YouTube content of the past. And there are some newer contents that ProtoWeb allows. I plan to cover this in the near future. Not only I got watching videos somewhat covered, there is also internet radio for my music needs. I mean, sure, I could just throw a collection of MP3s onto my hard drive, but that would take a lot of space. Unless I decide to play it on a network drive that is currently run by a Windows XP VM. Either way, it is safe to say that Shoutcast is still going strong, and if you want to stream your own music locally, you should check out Wackup, which has a built-in server for Shoutcast you can put together. Honestly, I've kind of enjoyed the bit of this machine despite not owning a 3DFX card, and it sort of proves that you really don't need it for most games. Although, there are some games that exclusively need a 3DFX card. But you could try Glide Wrapper off the internet, but then again, your mileage may vary for this one. Anyway, that about wraps up this tech video. Did you buy a faster processor or a 3DFX card back then? I would like to hear it in the comments section down below. And as always, peace out.